There is a very quiet assumption hidden inside the way we speak about life, and it usually sounds like this. This is who I am, and this is the life I've been given. It sounds factual, almost polite. As if identity were a parcel delivered to your door, already wrapped, already labeled, and your task were simply to open it and live inside whatever you find. Most people never question that assumption. They don't argue with it. They don't even notice it. They wake up into it each morning the way you wake up into gravity. There is a sense that the self is already here, already formed, already standing at the center of experience, watching the world go by. And life, from that point of view, becomes something that happens to this self. A sequence of events arriving from the outside, asking to be handled, survived, interpreted. But if you watch something that is not burdened with this assumption, the picture begins to wobble slightly. Consider a cloud drifting across the sky. Not as poetry, not as symbolism, just as a physical event. The cloud does not appear to be concerned with being a cloud. It does not pause to define itself, to check whether it is moving correctly, or whether it is becoming the right kind of shape. It forms, it changes, it thins, it dissolves, and nowhere in that process is there a separate entity standing behind the scenes, insisting, "This is me." Or think of a child absorbed in a game, before the idea of playing a role has fully taken hold. The child does not say, "I am pretending to be a pirate." The child is the pirate, until suddenly they are not, and then they are something else entirely. There is no anxiety about consistency. No fear of contradiction. Identity flows the way a melody flows, without asking whether it is allowed to change notes. And it is here that an old metaphor quietly enters the room, not as an answer, but as a disturbance. Imagine, for a moment, that you could dream any life you wanted. Not just pleasant scenes, but a whole existence. You could design the triumphs, the failures, the surprises, the long quiet stretches, the moments of intensity. You could decide where you are born, what kind of body you have, what kind of challenges you face. And suppose that, night after night, you explored every variation you could imagine: power, comfort, romance, mastery, peace. At first, you would likely choose dreams that feel unmistakably good. You would fly, you would be admired, you would be safe, you would win. And yet, after some time, how long is difficult to say, you might begin to notice something curious. The dream that always goes your way starts to feel thin, predictable, almost unreal in its smoothness. There is nothing at stake, nothing that can truly surprise you. So perhaps you begin to introduce a little uncertainty, a small risk, a challenge. Not too much at first, just enough to feel the texture of resistance, and then gradually more complexity appears. Confusion, loss, conflict, the possibility of not knowing what comes next. And strangely, the dream becomes more vivid, more convincing, more alive. Eventually, and this is the unsettling part, you might decide to dream a life so convincing that you forget it is a dream at all. Not because you want to escape, but because only then does the drama fully work. Only then does love feel fragile. Only then does meaning feel urgent. Only then does existence feel dense enough to take seriously. And when you wake up inside that dream, you do not say, "I am dreaming." You say, "This is me." You say, "This is my life." You begin to defend it, explain it, worry about it. You begin to feel that something precious could be lost. Now, notice what happens here. The metaphor is not saying that life is a dream in the sense of being fake or unimportant. Quite the opposite. It is pointing to how deeply convincing experience becomes when there is no distance between the one who experiences and what is being experienced. The dream works precisely because the dreamer is not standing outside of it, analyzing the plot. And yet, somewhere along the way, something subtle hardens. The sense of self, which may have begun as a useful reference point, becomes a fixed position, a center that must be protected, a story that must remain coherent. Identity starts to feel like a job that needs constant maintenance. You remember who you were yesterday, so that today will make sense. You anticipate who you must become tomorrow, so that today will feel justified. The dream tightens, and with that tightening comes a peculiar tension, not dramatic, not always conscious, but persistent. A background hum of concern. Am I doing this right? Am I falling behind? Is this who I am supposed to be? The dream, once fluid, begins to feel heavy, as though it must now be carried instead of lived. We rarely question this heaviness. We assume it is simply part of being human. But it is worth noticing that the weight does not come from experience itself. It comes from the effort to hold experience still long enough to call it me. The cloud does not suffer this problem. The child at play does not either. Not because they have discovered something profound, but because nothing in their experience insists on freezing itself into a permanent shape. And perhaps the metaphor is gently suggesting, not explaining, not instructing something about the way consciousness plays with form. About how identity may be less like a solid object and more like a rhythm. Something that appears convincing when taken seriously and exhausting when taken literally. At this point, the mind often wants to rush ahead, to ask what this means, to extract a lesson. But that movement itself belongs to the same dream impulse, the need to secure meaning, to arrive somewhere stable. So instead of doing that, it may be enough, for now, to simply notice the sensation of being here. Not as a self-observing life, but as the movement of experience itself, moment by moment, assembling and dissolving the idea of a center. The dream does not need to end for this noticing to occur. And the noticing does not need to change anything. It simply loosens the grip, ever so slightly, on the assumption that there must be someone inside the dream who has it all under control. When the idea of the dream settles in this way, it has a peculiar effect. It doesn't shout. It doesn't try to convince. It simply lingers, like a question that never quite turns into a question. And in that lingering, certain everyday experiences begin to look slightly different, not because they have changed, but because the angle from which they are seen has softened. Take the feeling of being someone in particular, not in a dramatic sense, no great crisis of identity, but the quiet continuity you assume as you move through the day. You remember your name. You recognize your habits. You carry a sense of personal history the way you carry a wallet, rarely examined, but always presumed to be there. And yet, if you pause long enough, you may notice that this continuity is not something you directly experience. What you experience are thoughts appearing now, sensations arising now, memories showing up now. The idea of a continuous me is assembled from these fragments, stitched together so smoothly that the seams are rarely visible. It is rather like watching a film and forgetting that it is made of individual frames. The movement feels real, fluid, undeniable, but the motion exists only because the frames pass quickly enough to give the illusion of continuity. Slow it down, and the solidity disappears into flickers. In much the same way, the self feels stable because it is refreshed constantly. A memory reinforces it. A plan extends it forward. A feeling gives it emotional weight. And so the dream remains convincing not because it is false, but because it is continuously recreated. Now, notice how deeply this affects the way life is lived. If you believe you are a fixed entity moving through time, then time becomes a kind of pressure. The past defines you. The future evaluates you. Each moment becomes a checkpoint, asking whether you are progressing correctly along the imagined path of your life. And even pleasure, under these conditions, becomes strangely tense. You don't simply enjoy it. You register it, compare it, worry about its duration. The dream becomes serious. But seriousness is an interesting thing. It often disguises itself as responsibility, as realism, as maturity. Yet at its core, seriousness is the insistence that what is happening right now must justify itself in relation to a story. It must mean something. It must lead somewhere. It must add up. And this is where the metaphor of dreaming grows more subtle. In a nighttime dream, the moment you become overly serious about what is happening, the dream either collapses or turns strange. You begin to question the setting. The logic breaks. The scene shifts abruptly. Seriousness destabilizes the illusion because it introduces distance between the dreamer and the dream. In waking life, however, seriousness does the opposite. It reinforces the illusion. It convinces you that this version of events is not only real, but heavy with consequence. It tells you that mistakes are permanent, that roles must be defended, that identities must be maintained. And from this seriousness emerges a peculiar kind of anxiety, not sharp enough to be panic, not dramatic enough to demand attention, but constant enough to color everything. A sense of being slightly late, slightly off, slightly at risk of misplaying the role. You feel it in ordinary places, in conversations where you are half listening and half monitoring how you are being perceived, in work where the task itself matters less than what it says about you, even in rest where relaxation becomes another performance. Am I resting correctly? Am I making the most of this time? The dream tightens again, not through pain, but through control. And control, when examined closely, turns out to be a response to the fear of disappearance. If the self is real and solid, then it can be lost, damaged, diminished. So it must be guarded, improved, secured against uncertainty. The dream becomes a fortress, built out of habits, expectations, and explanations. Yet something curious persists beneath all this effort. Experience keeps happening on its own. Thoughts appear without permission. Feelings arise without consulting identity. Perceptions shift regardless of plans. Even the sense of I arrives already formed, without being summoned. You do not create the thought I am here any more than you create the sound of a bird outside the window. It simply happens, and then it passes. This does not mean the dream is failing. On the contrary, this spontaneous quality is what allows the dream to feel alive. But it does suggest that the dream does not require a manager. It does not need a central authority to keep it running. The sense of control, while compelling, may be more ornamental than functional. At this point, many people instinctively recoil. The idea that there is no solid manager behind experience can feel destabilizing, even threatening. But notice that the fear itself arises within experience, just like everything else. It too is part of the dream's texture. And so the question is not whether the dream should end, or whether identity should dissolve, or whether life should be taken less seriously. Those are conclusions, and conclusions belong to the same structure that is being quietly observed. The more interesting movement is subtler. It is the recognition that what you call your life may be less like a possession and more like a process, less like a thing you have and more like something that is happening, fluid, ungraspable, convincing precisely because it does not stop to explain itself. The dream continues, scenes unfolding one after another. You still speak, work, remember, plan. But the sense that there must be someone inside it all, pulling the strings, begins to loosen, not dramatically, not permanently, but just enough to let the experience breathe. And in that small loosening, seriousness softens. Control relaxes its grip, not because anything has been solved, but because the need to solve begins to feel slightly out of place. The dream, after all, was never asking to be managed. It was asking to be lived. As this softening takes place, something else becomes visible, something that was always present, but usually overlooked because it does not announce itself. It is the way experience organizes itself without consulting the idea of a central character. Events unfold, thoughts arise, emotions surge and recede, and all of it happens with or without a clear sense of ownership. Ordinarily, the mind rushes in to claim what appears. My thought, my feeling, my memory. The labels arrive so quickly that they seem inseparable from the experience itself. But if you slow the moment down, just enough to notice, not enough to interfere, you may catch a glimpse of something quieter. The experience arrives first. The ownership follows. This sequence matters more than it seems. Because once ownership is assumed, experience acquires weight. A thought is no longer just a soundless sentence passing through awareness. It becomes a statement about who you are. A feeling is no longer just a wave of sensation. It becomes evidence. A memory is no longer an echo. It becomes an anchor. Identity thickens, not through force, but through accumulation. And the dream grows denser. You can feel this density most clearly in moments of emotional charge. Suppose a feeling of sadness appears. Before it can fully express itself, the mind wraps it in a story. I am sad because this is happening to me. The sadness is no longer free to move. It must now justify its presence within the narrative of a life. It must explain itself. It must fit. The same happens with joy. A pleasant moment arises, light and unburdened. Almost immediately, it is evaluated. How long will this last? Why don't I feel this way more often? What does this say about my life? Joy, too, becomes a responsibility. In this way, even the most ordinary emotions are recruited into maintaining the dream of a coherent self. And maintaining coherence requires effort. It requires vigilance. It requires remembering who you were supposed to be when you woke up this morning. This effort is rarely acknowledged. It operates in the background, shaping decisions, reactions, even silences. You hesitate before speaking, not because words are unavailable, but because you are checking whether they align with the character you believe yourself to be. You feel tension before acting, not because action is difficult, but because the consequences must be managed in advance. The dream becomes careful. And yet, life itself remains remarkably indifferent to this carefulness. The body breathes without permission. The heart adjusts its rhythm without consultation. Attention drifts, snaps back, wanders again. Even the sense of choosing so central to the idea of a self appears after the fact, narrating a decision that has already begun to take shape. This is not a philosophical claim. It is an observation available in the smallest moments. Watch how a thought begins. You do not hear silence, then decide what to think, then think it. The thought arrives already formed, like a visitor who has let themselves in. Only afterward does the mind say, I thought this. In the same way, the sense of being a self arrives as a conclusion, not as a cause. This does not make the self unreal in a dismissive sense. It makes it contextual, functional, like a character in a story that works precisely because it is taken seriously within the narrative. The problem is not the character. The problem arises when the character is mistaken for the author. And this is where the dream metaphor deepens again. In a dream, the characters feel autonomous. They have desires, fears, histories. They act as though the world depends on them. And within the dream, this is entirely convincing. But upon waking, you do not conclude that the characters were mistakes. You simply see that they were expressions of a larger movement imagination playing with form. What if waking life operates in a similar way, not as illusion versus reality, but as layers of participation? What if the sense of being a separate self is not an error to be corrected, but a role that becomes burdensome when taken as absolute? This question does not demand an answer. It functions more like a pause in the narrative, a moment where the story stops pushing forward and simply hovers. In that hovering, something subtle happens to anxiety. Anxiety thrives on the assumption that there is a solid center that must navigate an unpredictable world. It feeds on the belief that outcomes determine worth, that identity must be protected across time. But when the sense of center loosens even slightly, anxiety loses its anchor. It still appears, but it appears more like weather than like a verdict. You notice this in small ways. A worry arises, but it does not immediately demand obedience. A fear surfaces, but it does not automatically define the moment. There is space not as an achievement, not as a technique, but as a byproduct of seeing that experience is already moving on its own. And in this space, the dream does something unexpected. It becomes lighter without becoming less real. The world still matters. Relationships still affect you. Loss still hurts. Time still moves. But the sense that all of this must be held together by a central identity begins to feel unnecessary, like gripping water too tightly and then discovering that it flows more easily when the hand relaxes. You still play the role. You still answer to your name. You still participate fully in the unfolding of life, but the performance loses its strain. The character is allowed to breathe. And perhaps this is the quiet shift the metaphor has been pointing toward all along, not an awakening, not a revelation, but a reorientation. A slight turn of attention away from managing the dream and toward noticing how effortlessly it is already happening. The dream continues to dream itself, and you find yourself less certain of where the dream ends and where the dreamer begins, if that distinction ever truly held. When this uncertainty settles in, not as a problem, but as a gentle blur, the world begins to feel strangely intimate. Not closer in an emotional sense, not warmer or kinder, but more immediate. Less filtered through the constant question of what does this mean for me, and more present as a simple unfolding of sound, movement, texture, and change. You notice this intimacy most clearly in ordinary moments. Waiting for a message, standing in a line, watching light shift across a wall as the day moves on without asking for permission. These moments are usually overlooked because they do not advance the story. They do not contribute to the narrative of progress, success, or becoming. And yet, when the grip on identity loosens, they reveal themselves as complete in their own quiet way. The dream, it turns out, is not made only of dramatic scenes. It is composed largely of pauses. But the mind, trained to seek continuity and control, often treats these pauses as interruptions. Empty spaces to be filled, time to be used efficiently. Even silence becomes suspicious, and so the dream resumes its familiar pace, rushing forward, eager to re-establish momentum. This rushing is subtle. It hides behind productivity, behind planning, behind improvement. It whispers that life is happening somewhere else later, better arranged, more fully realized. And in doing so, it gently pulls attention away from what is already here, already complete in its incompleteness. The dream becomes slightly out of sync with itself. Yet even this misalignment is part of the movement. Nothing has gone wrong. The dream includes forgetting, just as it includes remembering. It includes tension, just as it includes ease. There is no ideal state it is trying to reach. The idea that it should arrive somewhere is itself another scene within the dream. And this is where the metaphor circles back on itself. If you truly could dream any life, endlessly, without consequence, you would not remain forever in comfort or clarity. You would eventually introduce confusion again. Not because confusion is desirable, but because it deepens the texture of experience. It makes attention sharper. It makes moments matter. From this perspective, uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a feature. The feeling of being slightly lost is not evidence of failure. It is a sign that the dream is working. The sense of not fully knowing who you are is not a problem to be solved. It is the openness that allows experience to keep unfolding. And so identity, once seen as something that must be defended, begins to resemble something more playful. Less like a definition, and more like a costume worn for the sake of participation. You still wear it, you still respond through it, but you no longer mistake it for your skin. This does not remove difficulty from life. Pain still arrives. Loss still leaves its mark. Time still carries things away. But these movements are no longer interpreted exclusively through the lens of what is happening to me. They are allowed to be what they are, events within a vast, impersonal, intimate process that includes you without centering on you. The dream, in this sense, becomes oddly compassionate, not because it spares you discomfort, but because it no longer demands that discomfort justify itself. Suffering does not need to prove anything. Joy does not need to last. Meaning does not need to be secured. Everything is permitted to appear and disappear. And perhaps this is the softest shift of all, not the realization that life is a dream, but the recognition that the dream does not belong to anyone. There is no separate dreamer standing outside, no final perspective waiting to be reached. There is only this ongoing play of forms, sensations, thoughts, and stories convincing, moving, serious, absurd arising and dissolving moment by moment. You are not watching the dream from a distance. You are not trapped inside it either. You are what it feels like when the dream is happening. And in that feeling, nothing needs to be concluded. Nothing needs to be fixed. The dream continues, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as an experience to be lived lightly, seriously, imperfectly, exactly as it is.